Welcome all to the IOS seminar, the new academic year. Just a bit of news, actually, the Bar Centre was very recently granted charitable status. So just a very quick advert to say that if you like our work and want to donate, please, we'll having a donate button set up on the website very soon now. And I encourage you to come visit our YouTube site. So tonight we're absolutely delighted to have the author and social historian Sarah Wise. She'll be talking to us about her latest extremely good book. I have a copy here, so please go out and buy it. It's called The Undesirables, The Law That Locked Away a Generation. She's also the author of a number of books on Victorian issues, including Inconvenient People, The Blackest Secrets, and The Italian Boy, which won a Gold Dagger Award in the Crime Writers Association on non-fiction. But today we'll be talking about a 20th century phenomenon. And without further ado, I'll pass on to Sarah.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you all for coming on to this Zoom call. I'm going to talk for around 40 minutes and then open it up to questions or points or anything anybody wants to add into the discussion of what is still, unfortunately, still a very live topic. I'm going to be talking first of all about the late Victorian and Edwardian origins of the Mental Deficiency Act 1913, and then move on to think about the impact of this terrible piece of legislation which wrecked so many lives. But I'm actually, having said that, I'm actually going to start in the early summer of 1972, if I can get my slide to move. Can you all see that second slide there? St Catherine's Psychiatric Hospital in Doncaster in South Yorkshire made the newspaper headlines when 3 elderly women were discovered languishing on the back wards of St Catherine's during a mass patient reclassification exercise. 2 of the women were aged 68, the other was 74, and each of them had been put away in their adolescence in the 1920s for having had a baby out of wedlock. All 3 were declared in 1972 to be neither mentally ill nor learning disabled. All 3 of them had lost contact with anyone on the outside who had once known them. One of the 68-year-olds had originally been certified as mentally defective after getting pregnant at the age of 19. Her widowed mother, who was in poor health, had signed the paperwork that the authorities had placed in front of her without questioning its meaning. This woman told the Daily Mirror newspaper, "All I want now is a little job doing domestic work." The other 2 women were released into an old people's home in Dewsbury, since the staff at St Catherine's believed that they'd become so institutionalised over the decades that independent living wasn't likely to be a good option for them. The Doncaster discoveries prompted other health authorities to do a similar analysis of their long-stay patients to see whether they included any elderly people originally admitted under the 1913 Mental Deficiency Act, and to see if they could now be freed and helped to establish some kind of independent life for themselves. For what it's worth, the National Association for Mental Health, which would later be renamed Mind, estimated from the Doncaster scandal that there were likely to be around 30,000 people still being detained in British psychiatric hospitals who'd originally been certified for social or moral reasons, rather than because of any genuine unsoundness of mind, whether that was a mental illness or a learning disability. Many British families have stories of female relatives who were put away for having had a baby out of wedlock. And as the years passed with no one to champion them, these women had drifted over from the specialist mental deficiency colony into the mental hospital system proper. Perhaps some of them had actually developed a mental illness, and that's not so very surprising when you think of what they'd been put through. Arbitrarily locked away with their baby taken away from them, deceived and abandoned by the child's father, and shunned by relatives and former friends and neighbours. Or if they hadn't actually become ill, they had perhaps become institutionalized, the impact of having had their independence removed for decades, causing behavior which to the casual glance was indistinguishable from mental illness. Girls and women locked up in these circumstances comprise a huge amount of these cases, probably the majority, although it's very difficult to know that conclusively. But we mustn't lose sight of the boys and the young men who also spent decades locked up under the Mental Deficiency Act. A man known in the records only as Bert had been detained as a moral defective following a conviction for burglary, and he was now entering his 20th year of incarceration in a mental deficiency colony when his case was finally raised by campaigners. Meanwhile, John, again, probably not his real name, beat even Bert's epic confinement, placed into an institution in the north of England at the age of 3. He was discovered 44 years later, unable to state any details about his past, apart from his date of birth, which he had been allowed to know. When a campaigner seeking John's release asked to see the paperwork by which he'd been certified as a toddler, the institution simply took John before a local magistrate and claimed that he could now retrospectively be described as found neglected. Found neglected was one of the clauses in the Mental Deficiency Act that could trigger a certification. Someone could be declared abandoned, neglected, or without visible means of support, and thereby in need of being sent to a place of safety. And I'll come back to the misuse of this clause later on, because often a place of safety was quite simply a mental deficiency colony when there wasn't any clear evidence that the person had a mental deficiency. So in this case, the magistrate didn't ask any questions, and John was now returned to the institution, the documentation, though totally false, retrospectively making his detention appear legal. The National Council for Civil Liberties called John the Forgotten Man in their magazine, Civil Liberty. And they stated, "We found a situation we would have thought impossible in the 20th century." There is a happy ending to John's story. The NCCL found him a job in a hotel, which meant that he could now no longer be labelled abandoned, neglected, and without visible means of support. And they later reported that he gives every satisfaction. He has opened his own post office savings account. He has begun to develop personal friendships and is learning the elements of writing, the use of the telephone, and 101 other little things that have been kept from him for 44 years. Thousands of lives were wasted in the mental deficiency system in the 46 years that the Act was in operation. And this was a colossal squandering of human potential. Many of those who've been detained went to their graves without their stories ever being heard, the bulk of them, in fact. And with the Undesirables, I've tried to put some of these stories back on the record. This remarkably authoritarian Act of Parliament was the closest that Britain got to implementing eugenic ideas in public policy, because these were to be detentions for life in sex-segregated mental deficiency colonies so that they could not breed a future generation of defectives. And the Act was passed in order to deal with the alleged ongoing deterioration of the mind and morals of the great British public. Now, there were 6 main factors that were causing panic amongst the governing class, the decision makers, if you like, the formulators of policy at the end of the 19th and start of the 20th century. So first of all, we've got a huge, what we would call a database of information about people going into prison, casebook after casebook being kept by medical officers in Britain's prisons. Sooner or later, this builds up into a kind of a huge amount of documentation that the experts can pore over. And one of the things they start to believe is that there's a hardcore of criminals upon whom no form of punishment has any effect whatsoever. So there's something kind of intrinsically wrong with them. That's the kind of belief that got going. In a similar way, we get compulsory elementary education across the nation from 1880 onwards. And this again builds up this huge, great database of information about the children and about their parents. So people start to notice, for example, an unexpectedly large number, much larger than expected, number of children who struggle to acquire even the most basic skills. So that starts to worry policymakers. Kind of linked to that, we've got this idea that Britain's workers aren't as efficient as they could be. In particular, they're not as efficient as workers in Germany, which is always the big comparator nation. Britain is starting to face unprecedented competition, economic competition, from other nations, Germany in particular, and America. So we're starting to think, are our working class up to it? Are there problem areas within that population? Again, kind of linked to that, people are starting to have fewer and fewer children from about 1870 onwards. But the people who are really starting to have fewer children are the wealthy, the middle and the upper classes. There's a slight fall off in working class birth rates, but not anything like the 20% fall that we see between 1870 and 1900 amongst the middle and upper classes. So there's that kind of demographic emergency idea going on there. And linked to that, there's this idea that amongst the working classes, the people who are having the most number of children are the allegedly feeble-minded. Rescue societies, lots and lots of different little organizations trying to keep girls and women from going onto the street, take them in if they've been the subject of sexual assault and rape. And they start to get the idea that some of these girls haven't been able to say no. Yes, they've been sexually assaulted. Others may have been easily led by men, so sexual coercion rather than all-out rape. So that starts to worry them as well. And then finally, the optimism in British psychiatry, 1840, dying by about the mid-1860s. We can't cure many of the conditions that are coming before us. So is there in fact a kind of inherent inbuilt biological reason so many of these people are not savable? So that's the kind of background to this birth of the idea of biological degeneration. It seems to offer a snap solution to some of these things that are being noticed at the end of the 19th century. And some people think, can any form of social failure and even deep chronic poverty also be attributed to biological degeneration? Now, the deep pockets and the absolutely brilliant campaigning skills of the Eugenics Education Society, to give it its original name, won over many members of Parliament who really should have known better. And during 2 years of parliamentary debates on mental deficiency bills, this was the only man in Parliament who was really able to see the pitfalls of this proposed new category that policymakers were starting to put together. There's a wonderful biography of him by his niece, a fantastic, charismatic man, Josiah Wedgwood of the Midlands pottery dynasty. She said he had a charm which the years developed into one of his surest weapons. Indignant dowagers and crusted colonels who got into his company somehow by error, thinking him little less than Antichrist, thawed into genial streams of small talk under his sunshine. Wedgwood completely saw the problems if you're going to start locking people up for life en masse so that they can't breed children on deeply, deeply flawed and unproven scientific data. And he's passionate about individual liberty. He says the spirit at the back of the mental deficiency bill is not the spirit of charity, not the spirit of the love of mankind. It is a spirit of the horrible eugenic society, which is setting out to breed up the working classes as though they were cattle. So here are the formal 1913 explanations of the new categories that are planned to be introduced. And these are new. There's nothing in the 19th century that kind of is like this, is exactly like this. So they define this thing, feeble-minded, as persons who may be capable of earning a living under favourable circumstances, but are incapable from mental defect existing from birth or earlier age of A, competing on equal terms with their normal fellows. So there's that work worry, again, that idea about, are you a good worker? Or B, managing themselves and their affairs with ordinary prudence. And the second new category is the moral imbecile. Persons who from an early age display some mental defect coupled with strange, vicious, or criminal propensities, on which punishment has little or no deterrent effect. So someone very important actually who thought, oh no, 10 years later, but he says this about this idea of the moral imbecile. Wherein lies their defect? It's not defect of knowledge, of intelligence in the educational sense, but failure to adjust themselves to the social conditions in which they live. So like Wedgwood, he instantly sees this is some kind of social engineering. It's not really to do with biology or science. So dissatisfaction with this new moral imbecile category in the Mental Deficiency Act rested partly on that unsolved conundrum that the habitual criminal or antisocial, someone with antisocial behaviour, didn't relate in a straightforward way to intelligence or to intellectual ability. The psychopath, for example, which is the very worst grade of moral imbecile, if you take this definition, they usually have at least average and quite often high intelligence. So where does that leave you when you're trying to deduce who is a moral imbecile? So why was it that Wedgwood was so isolated in Parliament in his views? By the time of the final vote on this bill in Parliament, he's one of only 3 MPs voting against it, which is really quite extraordinary. Where was the rest of Britain on this topic in 1913? Are the MPs really legislating because it's a popular point of view? It's difficult because they didn't have opinion polling like we have today, asking the public what they think about a certain thing. So we've only got glimpses of what the public might be thinking. Dr. Montague David Eder was an early adopter of psychoanalysis in this country, in Britain. And in a series of columns that he wrote for the Daily Herald newspaper, he said that the Mental Deficiency Bill was hugely unpopular. He said public opinion against it was everywhere perceptible in train or tram or bus. So, that's the famous man on the Clapham omnibus. He does not like this attempt to crack down on certain sections of society. He'd also spotted, as had Wedgwood, the class bias inherent in the Mental Deficiency Act. So in his column, he talks about how any poor wretch convicted of stealing a doormat or a loaf of bread could at once be rushed into the institution. The maker of illicit gains on the stock market will escape. Another little glimpse of the fact that this wasn't very popular, it wasn't grassroots legislation, is the fact that the government very early on dropped its original proposals in the bills to ban the marriage of people deemed to be feeble-minded. They got the message quite clear that governmental influence into British private lives of that kind would be extremely unpopular with the general public. And fears of a public and a newspaper backlash, they're not the same thing. A newspaper backlash and a public backlash can't be considered in the same way. But nevertheless, those were also behind the refusal of policymakers to give a single inch to the Eugenics Society on the topic of the voluntary sterilisation of the unfit. In 1910, Liberal MP Charles Masterman told the new Home Secretary, Winston Churchill, in a memo that I found in the National Archives, he wrote the following words: "I feel inclined to suggest minuting bring this up again on January the 1st, 1950. I'm absolutely certain that any proposition whatsoever giving these powers, i.e. powers of sterilisation, is outside the possibilities of the present legislation. We cannot carry public opinion with us beyond this." So that's very interesting. Internal memo where he's saying to the Home Secretary, lay off. The British will not take any kind of moves towards sterilisation. For his part, Keir Hardie's newspaper, the Labour leader, stated that feeble-minded children weren't suffering from an inherited condition, but instead, and I'm quoting directly, they were the outcome of poverty, low wages, bad housing, and the terrible stress of modern life. Parliament should address itself to the removal of these causes and not tinker with their effects. Nevertheless, Hardie never says a word about the legislation ever, and those Labour MPs who didn't actually abstain on the bill actually voted in favour of the Act. So with all three main political parties and their supporters broadly in favour of the legislation, the Roman Catholic Church presented the sole united opposition to the Mental Deficiency Act. And they would always maintain that position that this is all completely wrong. So that, in brief, is how that controversial legislation came to be passed. The experts, if you like, were just louder and more persuasive with Parliament in mind. In terms of the actual operation of the Act, youngsters came to the attention of the mental deficiency authorities in three main ways. Firstly, when they came up in court and the court medical officer suspected that their criminal offending indicated an inherent inability to know right from wrong. Secondly, if the local authority's mental deficiency officer had his attention brought to the youngster, perhaps by a teacher or by some other local figure of authority, the local mental deficiency officer, by the way, was known in some parts of the country colloquially as the rat catcher. And thirdly, and perhaps most upsettingly, it was often, perhaps usually, the parents or the guardians who asked the local authority's mental deficiency committee to ascertain a family member with a view to certification on the grounds of feeble-mindedness, particularly if it was the case of a pregnant unmarried girl or young woman. This may have been done to avoid the shame that illegitimacy might bring to the family, or perhaps to cover up and deflect from incestuous abuse. So we shouldn't let the British public off the hook. A significant proportion of families handed over their troublesome youngsters without any pressure being applied to them. Many families chose not to visit or to keep in touch once their family went into the mental deficiency colony system. That said, we do have examples where families were deceived about the kind of care that their youngster was being placed into. Campaigners even uncovered examples where a clearly forged signature was used on the paperwork. 27-year-old Peggy Richards was released from Rampton in April 1961. She'd been removed from her home at the age of 8 for being mischievous, high-spirited, bit light-fingered. She often jumped on other girls' bicycles and pedalled off laughing. I was always having to give her a good hiding, Peggy's elderly mother told the Sunday Pictorial newspaper. A local authority official told Peggy's mother and father that Peggy should go into a foster home for 2 years where she could be trained to be a good girl. They had no idea what they were agreeing to. And in fact, Peggy went into the first of a series of placements, and at the age of 21 was transferred across Rampton, all for stealing a bicycle and being a bit naughty when she was 8. And in fact, it was the press who quite early on seized on the newsworthiness of youngsters unfairly shut away under the 1913 Act. All of these stories made absolutely fantastic fodder for the tabloids. The headlines kind of wrote themselves. So as early as 1925, so that's just 12 years after the Act's been passed, the press coverage of Dora Thorpe's plight led to questions in the House of Commons. Dora had been a persistent truant, and during a hearing into her absenteeism, she'd called the school board inspector a liar. As a result, the magistrate sent her at the age of 12 to a residential school, and from there, without her parents' consent, she was passed at the age of 16 straight across into Stoke Park Mental Deficiency Colony near Bristol, and she'd been declared on the paperwork feeble-minded. At Stoke Park, she worked as a weaver at a hand loom from 8:30 in the morning to 4:30 in the afternoon for an annual salary of 6 shillings. And they might as well, at that rate, they might as well not pay her at all. The newspaper agitation worked, and Dora, by now 26 years old, was re-examined, found to be of completely ordinary abilities and behaviour, and she was released into the care of her mother, and she found a steady job almost immediately. Popular Sunday newspaper John Bull took up the cudgels on behalf of young Bertie Brewster. His plight was made all the more sort of toothsome for the reading public because he was actually being employed as a special police constable in the Ipswich force. He had spent 4 years in the Royal Eastern Counties Institution, a mental deficiency colony in Colchester. And then he'd originally been certified because of his aggressive behaviour towards other children. Subsequently, he was spending 7 years out on licence, and part of his licence conditions, he had to follow these rules. Never be out of doors after 8 p.m, never change his address without telling the Board of Control, that's the Home Office department that dealt with these matters, never leave Ipswich, not even for a weekend or a holiday, never go to the cinema unless he's with his mom and dad, never go into a pub, never have any women friends that aren't your relatives, never marry. So there's that eugenic idea again. Don't have children because whatever you've got, you're going to pass on to them. John Bull's publicity worked. His certification was instantly overturned, and a Board of Control memo that I found at the National Archives admitted that this should probably have happened years earlier. So the news of the world came into bat for Marjorie X. While she was out on license, she'd formed a perfectly innocent friendship with a young soldier who went to the same church services as her. And it took just 1 week of Marjorie being out on license for someone to snoop and snitch to the Board of Control, and Marjorie was instantly whipped back into Etlow House in Leighton in Essex. There'd never been anything wrong with Marjorie's intelligence or behaviour. But her story is absolutely typical of many people who found themselves under lock and key for years. So it's worth telling. Her parents had had a very unhappy marriage, and the household was very stormy. The rows frightened Marjorie, and when she was still very young, teachers noticed a falling off in the quality of her schoolwork. As a divorce loomed, divorce in these years was hugely controversial. Marjorie got placed into a special school at the age of 11, and here she fell even further behind because the lessons at this special school were pretty much handicraft and domestic science, not much else. So when she was tested, she was on the one hand found to be very shy and nervous, but on the other, during the testing, she was contemptuous at the questions that she was being asked, saying they were fit only for a 4-year-old to answer, and she refused. She clammed up. So she gets marked down as ineducable, and she was sent to a residential school, excuse my language, but this was the language that was used for backward children. And then at the age of 16, she got passed automatically across to Etlow House. And here she worked in the laundry and the dressmaking workshop. And then at the age of 22, she was allowed out on license. And in her own words, she says it was then that I met a young soldier. He was very kind to me and took me out to the cinema twice. And I say that's when she the alert goes up. She's got a boyfriend. She'll be thinking of having children, and back she goes. So when the News of the World run this story, the Board of Control allowed her to have new tests and a new psychiatrist's report. And they showed that Marjorie, by now 33 years of age, was perfectly intelligent, perfectly capable. And despite 22 years in captivity of one sort or another, she didn't have any emotional problems whatsoever. And any of the tasks that she wasn't able to complete during this testing were purely down to the fact that she never had any academic education after the age of 11. So the Board of Control freed her instantly. So when the Mental Deficiency Act was passed, the point was made very clear that the certified would be sent into specialist new institutions, the mental deficiency colonies. I've put some pictures there up on the right of well, there's 4 of them on that slide. The Board of Control insisted that these were not mental hospitals, they were not Victorian lunatic asylums. So you might be wondering why I started this talk with information about people who'd been discharged from mental hospitals, stroke psychiatric hospitals. And it is true that the original committal had never been on the grounds that these people were mentally ill. So why was it that they passed from one system to another when they would finally get discovered during the emptying out, the decarceration, if you like, and the closing down of Britain's large mental hospitals? Well, especially after the Second World War, capacity issues and purely administrative crises saw the shunting around of inmates from colonies into mental hospitals. At Lancaster Moor Hospital, for example, a very large mental hospital up in the northwest, during a huge reclassification program of the hundreds of patients there in the early 1960s, the medical superintendent found that 20% of the females and 15% of the males weren't mental patients proper. They'd come over from the mental deficiency system, but had been transferred across during the sort of massive upheavals of World War II and had never been transferred back. So lots of patients in the 50s, 60s, and 70s remained displaced persons within the British mental health care system. And as I've said, people died off. They either chose not to visit ever, or they died off, or you're going to have a lot more difficulty visiting someone who's been shunted to a very far-flung part of the country from where they were originally. So from time to time, medical staff would warn of the problem of releasing a patient into what they described as unsuitable family life. Interviewed by academic Sheila Rolfe, one nurse said regarding some of the patients that he oversaw, "We didn't want them to return home. That was often where the problems had started. But the outside world was somewhere that they wanted to get to. They thought that would be Shangri-La." So the 1959 Mental Health Act repealed the 1913 Act, and it led to massive case reassessment exercises in the larger mental facilities, with the idea of releasing those who didn't suffer from severe mental illness or severe learning disability. Some 800 people who had been detained under the 1913 Act were immediately released, and 1,000 more the following year. In the first 10 years of releases after the 1915 Act, 1959 Act, the general trend was to swiftly move out those who had a very high likelihood of being able to hold down a job and who had some kind of relative still living, or who had been able to manage to keep some kind of connection with somebody in the outside world. For others, the issue of retaining the best workers within the hospital still held them in place. And unfortunately, a lot of that did go on. Another problem that hadn't been anticipated was the fact that if you've been in an institution for that long, somehow the outside world could actually seem absolutely terrifying. A survey that was undertaken by the King's Fund in 1972 of 2,000 patients in 9 mental hospitals reported that nearly half of them said that they would be sorry if they did have to leave. The report continues. The proportion of patients who accept the hospital as their home, where they can avoid the problems, personal or financial, of living outside its open gates, is sometimes a serious matter for concern. One released woman who'd done 50 years at Rampton, entering the institution at the age of 11, was described by a nursing sister after her release as having had her life absolutely ruined. She couldn't understand that the cutlery didn't have to be counted and that she didn't have to have a locked bedroom. So, just to sum up, historians have disagreed in the last 20, 25 years or so about the extent to which mental health and mental disability can be said to be part of a social control model. It's been argued that such a view fails to take account of the complexity of power relations and the agency of the patient. But immersion in the available case histories of those who were certified as moral imbeciles in the first half of the 20th century makes it very hard to see it as anything other than a method of controlling certain sections of society. Britain did decide to dispose wholesale of people who it wouldn't take the time or spend the money to help. Such time-consuming and costly interventions for the so-called socially inadequate were abandoned for the lock and key of the colony. It would be perverse, for instance, to see the mass incarceration of girls and women who had illegitimate children as anything other than a patriarchal control system, I would suggest. Similarly, the vast majority of people put away were working class, sometimes lower middle class, but mainly working class. And I think that overlooking that power imbalance seems a little bit naive too. So I'll come to an end now, and I'd be happy to field any questions or thoughts that you may have.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. That's a very interesting survey of a very dark subject. So if anybody would like a question, you can either sort of put your hand up, or if you don't want to do that, just put something in the chat and I can read out the question. You can be visible or invisible. I think. So first question is from Fiona Doherty. If you just come off
Hi
mute.
there. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed that. It is really it's quite eye-opening. I wonder if you could maybe talk to if you see some remnants of these archaic systems in the way that we set up institutions today. I'd find that really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely, I do. We were just discussing that before the Zoom started. In fact, what I'll do is I'll call up a slide that's kind of at the end. I wasn't sure how relevant it was be, but since you brought that up, we have got a real problem still with detention, unnecessary detention. Of people either with a learning disability or with autism being kept, I mean, permanently in units. And there are the figures. Can you see that slide? And it's stuck. It hasn't budged. This just has not budged. This amount of mainly young people. Now, it's slightly different. It's slightly tangential to mine because these are people with neurodivergency, whereas the people I'm talking about didn't have that for the most part. But we are still putting under lock and key people who do not need to be there. And when they do have family who want them back with them, who have support systems around them, and it will not budge. The absolutely brilliant people on this are the Learning Disability Network, a wonderful organisation that's been pushing hard for years and years to get these ATUs shut down or used as the way that it was supposed to be. You literally go in there for a short period for you to be assessed. What is the condition for which you suffer and what is the most appropriate way of caring for you? But they're not. They're being used as dumping grounds. I went to a brilliant talk and in July of last year, set up by the Learning Disability Network. And to my surprise, what they said was, yeah, money is an issue, but more of an issue is how the budgets are spent. And this kind of unshiftable mindset within those who spend the budgets, who see incarceration as something that they cling on to with the idea of kind of control. You've got those people where they're totally seeable and visible. They're not wandering off into the community, and so there is the money to set up localized little, if you like, sheltered housing, for example, or to keep someone in their home with daily or weekly social care visits as backup. But it's not being done because they just, willpower is missing. But I also suspect this kind of total lack of imagination once you're in that field. You don't want somebody coming from outside and suggesting a new way of doing it. Does that help answer, Fiona, at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking myself also of the foster system that we have, and you were speaking to that right at the end.
Yeah.
I actually read something recently of someone trying to argue that the foster system should be reimagined, and they'd set up a little house that was sort of more majorly run by the children themselves, with and more like a smaller group of children and a more sort of family-esque setting with advising adults and stuff like that. So yeah, just really interesting alternative ways to do that.
Since the 1830s, it really is that early, we've had really intelligent, experienced people suggesting how Britain might reimagine its, first of all, mental illness and now learning disability systems. I mean, brilliant, well thought through, not pie in the sky ideas, and it doesn't happen. And it's got to be about the mindset. I know money is always brought up, and I would never underestimate that, but the mindset isn't there. What do we do to change the mind of the people who are in those roles? How do you turn that over? And I say much cleverer and more experienced people than me in the Learning Disability Network. They're really worth looking up and following. They don't be able to put their point across to policymakers.
Okay, Professor Janet Melville Wiseman. your question.
Yeah, thanks. And apologies, my work title comes up whenever I use work Zoom, and I don't know how to get rid of it. But I didn't mean to have it there. But yeah, I'm professor of social work actually, and I used to be a mental health social worker. And I have a confession to make that I have assessed people under the Mental Health Act and made applications for them to be detained. I hope I only did it when it was absolutely necessary. And I certainly, one of the first things I did was learn how to disagree with psychiatrists as part of that process. But I just wanted to kind of pick up a couple of things, if I could, that it seemed to me, having practiced in the 1990s, at the point of the NHS and Community Care Act, when we had the big drive to empty the large psychiatric hospitals for people to live in the community, that nobody checked that actually the community probably wasn't ready to live with its mentally ill.
Absolutely.
And I don't think it is now. I think in some ways the situation has got even worse. And, it's fueled a lot by media headlines. And I really appreciated what you said at the start about public opinion isn't the same as what the media claim. That, we see a lot of headlines about, how dangerous people are these days rather than them being morally unacceptable. And I remember I did a calculation once that you're 10 times safer living with a stranger with a severe mental illness than you are living with your current partner. But that didn't go down very well. But that's true. Murder by the mentally ill has decreased, whereas by people who aren't, it's increased. One of the things I looked at for my PhD was the sexual abuse of vulnerable people in institutions. And I know that in the 1959 Act, there was a section that made it a criminal offence for people who worked or for men who worked in psychiatric hospitals to have sexual intercourse with patients. And that was only repealed by the Sexual Offences Act recently. And it looked at first sight like it was to protect them from sexual exploitation, but it wasn't. It was the eugenics movement alive and well, and trying to make sure that once they were in psychiatric hospitals that they didn't become pregnant and begat further defectives. But I don't know if it was in the 1913 Act, and I wondered if you knew about that.
No, it wasn't. And I'm surprised. Eugenics has a massive problem really getting under. I mean, it always had a problem with the public, but in terms of the intelligentsia, it starts to really lose its sheen in the late 1930s.
And Churchill was involved, wasn't he?
Sorry?
Churchill was a supporter.
Oh yeah, massive eugenicist.
And people
absolutely.
People like Dr. Bernardo also.
Lots and lots of people who should have known better. But the very interesting thing happens across the late 20s, early 30s. You've got very, very clever people working in the field of genetics who say all of these things were shouted about from 1880 onwards. 1883 is when Galton coins the term genetics. You have not been able to demonstrate this. You have not come up with a mathematical model to prove this. All of your anecdotes are still, are anecdotes. And you've got very clever mathematical modelers now. So maths really coming on in leaps and bounds in the 20s and 30s, where so you get a lot of geneticists distancing themselves from this idea that such conditions are passed on. You are completely unable to replicate that as a model. So it loses its intellectual heft. And then, of course, I won't say nail in the coffin, but serious damage that it took decades to come back from is Hitler's racialization of eugenics. So after the discoveries, the liberation of the camps in 1945, you're not really going to be shouting about, oh, I believe in selective breeding, and you know, that it's very unfashionable place to be. And it doesn't really, it's only within the last sort of 10, 15 years that certain public commentators have started to embrace it again. Why was I saying that? I don't know that the 1959 Act would have put that clause in order to prevent the breeding of undesirable children, because I think in 1959 people aren't really thinking like that. What happens is the whole anti mental moral defective shifts, the ground shifts from okay, we can't prove that it's biologically transmitted, but they make terrible parents and we've got to stop them having children on those grounds. So it's no longer a purely biological reason. They start to say, well, people with family histories like that shouldn't have children because they make terrible parents, and they will turn out terrible children from a cultural and social point of view, rather than, we can't prove what genes do it. So although they may well have not wanted psychiatric patients to have had babies as a result of rape, it will probably be because they think they would make a terrible mother. In the book, I go into later on the fact that Keith Joseph's famous pronouncement in 1973, "Stupid women should not have children." He's not really being eugenic, but culturally, there's a whole load of people we just don't want breeding because they're not like us, and there'll be more of them than there are of us. It's that mentality. That's what I would say.
And they won't know.
No, there wasn't anything in the Act about that. It did go on. We know tales of cruelty, but a man in that setting being discovered doing that would have been, well, if the will was there, you had the sexual offence, you had the Offences Against the Person Act of 1862 to prosecute him under for rape. So he would have been prosecuted for rape or sexual assault under any old legislation that anyone outside a psychiatric setting would have used. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat box about, does any of this apply to Scotland? And the answer is that my book really only deals with English and Welsh legislation. As far as I'm aware, you always had in the 19th century a separate Scottish commissioners in lunacy, mirroring the English commissioners in lunacy. And we know that there was that the legislation that comes in Britain is always very closely shadowed in Scotland on these topics. So it will have gone on, but unfortunately my book doesn't cover that. I'm really only dealing with England and Wales, but certainly many Scottish doctors in the 80s and 90s and the early 1900s had very strong opinion that this, particularly with women having 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 illegitimate children by different fathers, was a mental deficiency issue. And so we see certainly Scottish psychiatrists, Scottish doctors talking to the Royal Commission on the Care and Control of the Feeble-Minded in 1908. So certainly Scottish voices were very much heard. I've got no reason to think that Scotland operated as some kind of nirvana where these things didn't go on, sadly.
I can just ask a sort of slightly wider question, but if you've got any, I'm wondering why this movement seems so powerful and very much seemed to originate in England or in an Anglo-Saxon country, United Kingdom. And particularly given England is often held up as a proud defender of liberty and has traditions which defend against this kind of utilitarian, eugenic attempt to model society. And yet it happens here.
Yeah.
And it's we that influence other countries. And I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts as to why why it happened here in the way it
It
did.
certainly seems to be a Protestant solution. It doesn't start here. It's at its most virulent in certain states of America, namely California, who actually, Californian legislation on sterilization is the one that Hitler's policymakers go and read up on first. Scandinavia goes a lot further than we do and introduces involuntary sterilization. So we're not the worst offender, and in fact we never do officially embrace even in voluntary sterilization for people with learning disability. It's to do with Protestantism. It's to do with thinking you don't have to worry what the church says in these countries. They can have their opinion, but we're just going to, you know. So it's to do with thinking here is a social problem. And we are so clever that we're going to come up with scientific ways of solving our problems. I said in that slide that I showed with the areas of worry, a panic was setting in. And so this solution looks like something that will cover everything. If you stop feeble-minded and moral defective children being born, we will have a better race of Britons in every way. And I say the Eugenics Society was, it comes from the middle class intelligentsia, and it's a field in which women disproportionately got involved. You'd get very few women speaking out against these proposals. And there is a kind of link with some feminists, not all, that if you can get moral defectiveness stamped out, life will get a heck of a lot nicer for women, because a lot of the males who end up in mental deficiency colonies do so after being charged with or found guilty of sexual offences, including child sexual offences. So it was a very handy way of sweeping up that sector of society. The Eugenics Society was full of wealthy middle-class women and men, very deep pockets, who made brilliant arguments and claimed to back it up with science. And they didn't really start to get wobbled on that before real proper scientists could say, this is totally case not proven. And all the famous anecdotes you've come up with, we've tested them and they're not right. This social problem isn't something that's passed down genetically. There may be clusters, cultural clusters of bad behavior, but that is a totally different issue. They also, biologists start to realize that certain conditions that we call feeble-minded or certain forms of what we now call learning disability are absolutely linked to problems in utero. A lot of it caused by poor nutrition and terrible housing while a woman is pregnant, things going wrong, trauma happening at birth, or an accident to a child while the head is still forming. So the complications of what leads someone to be someone to have behavior that could be described insensitively as feeble-mindedness are huge, and you can no longer say, oh, that's because all the grandparents were like that. And you know, the complexity of the issue of learning disabilities becomes more apparent in the 1920s. And so your hardcore, who'd shouted so loud and lobbied so many MPs and got so many letters into the broadsheets, they're absolutely on the back foot now. They're losing the argument. But it's one of those cases where if you're going to pass really draconian legislation, you need to hold fire until you've got the proof. You know, you look like you've got the proof, but people who aren't scientists, Wedgwood's whole point was, we're entering a new age of scientific dictatorship, where the ordinary person, even the ordinary MP, cannot argue back against people with chairs and professorships in the biological sciences. You can't argue back against them. And the only people who could argue back against them are the people who came from that world, who were even cleverer, you know, and worked out there's a problem with this modeling, you know. So that's why. It doesn't really answer your question why Britain, but it's something to do with not having to worry about the church's opinion, thrusting forward and taking our scientific brilliance into sociology. I'd say that's what it is, that real scientific confidence, or perhaps overconfidence, maybe. Yeah.
Do you see sort of reasons for worry about that kind of thing in other areas or related areas popping up now?
Today,
Yeah, in today's world, yeah.
I
I mean,
think
the same kind of overconfidence of a certain kind of expert or science class, which
well,
nevertheless is rather examined, and
I
that there's a
don't know. I
social
mean, I'm
reason
I'm
behind it.
I'm on the I'm on the fence here, because I have no time whatsoever for COVID deniers, vaccination deniers. I think maybe that's our
Yeah.
very current problem with how much do you trust science, or how long are we waiting before in 10 years time they'll realize it wasn't. You know, I just think the problem is
So it's an opposite kind of problem. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
anti-science seems to be taking
Yeah.
hold, fueled by social media. If people on
Yeah.
social media are going to get angry, why aren't they rising up and screaming abuse and getting people, the 2,500 people, freed from assessment and treatment units? What a weird thing to get angry at. You know, the things we get angry about, the things we don't get angry about, astonish me. You know. So no, I don't know. I think you'd have a problem now passing anything that's so clearly class biased. I mean, Wedgwood and Dr. Montague David Eder spot it right away. Lots of people on what would be described as the far left spot the sex and the class bias in that act, that 1913 Act. The more everyone else from right-wing Labour right the way through to ultra, you know, everyone else is completely on the page, including liberals whose very name says that we don't do this sort of thing. The other people that, so you've got genuine socialists saying, no, this is to stop working class people breeding, it's the aristocracy, we've got to stop breeding, they're the only feeble-minded people. But the other people you get joining, you do see this in other parts of history, are what today we would call the Tory wets. So conservatives who believe absolutely in a social hierarchy, God at the top, royalty, aristocracy, and they have rights, but the wealthy have duties towards the lower orders. And one thing you don't do is try to interfere in their family life. So you get Protestant Tory wets. They were two of Wedgwood's voters against the bill, who say this is not British, this is not how the British behave. We are fair, you know, we take care of our lower orders. So a very interesting mix of people who would not shut up and who proved to be right. But the people who go missing are the Liberals, most of the Tory party, and far too much of the New Labour Party. So Keir Hardie having nothing to say about it is quite extraordinary. And most of the Labour Party voting for it.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any final questions? Okay, well, just thank you very much indeed for a wonderful panorama of
Thank you.
problems that I suspect never completely go away. Will come up in new forms. And I'd just like to thank everybody for coming for a really great. I think I encourage you to get the book again, The Undesirables by Sarah Wise, which is extremely readable and full of fascinating nuggets of history. So I never quite know how to applaud on these things, but I'll do it with my hands.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much indeed.
Thank you, Sarah.
We'll be back next month.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
very much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.